And I apologize I didn't update that information for the next webinar, but the next one will be October 15th, and I believe I put that at the end of the presentation. Nolan Deskin, the state climatologist from Colorado, will be presenting next week. And there you have also the links to sign up for future webinars.
Next month.
Oh, right, yeah.
October 15th.
Yeah, right. And also the link there to access the recorded presentations as well. All right, next slide. Next slide is just our agenda here. We'll talk a little bit about historical conditions from the last month or so, and then get into kind of where we are today and looking towards the outlook into the next season. And the next slide shows August temperature ranks. This is average temperature, so kind of middle of the pack across the northern states from the Dakotas over to Michigan. Those white areas, the white states, were near average for temperature for August in general. The blue colors are slightly below average, and you can see the numbers there in the rankings. Generally, the southern part of the region was more on the cooler side for the month of August. In the next slide, some really extreme events, individual events, make South Dakota wet in August. But in general, across the region, pretty much near average for the month and slightly on the dry side, as you can see with North Dakota and the eastern Corn Belt states, Indiana, Ohio. So in general, though, seems to be then near average. And we'll see that in the next slide there with the last 30 days precipitation. This is from the High Plains Regional Climate Center, and the map on the left is total precipitation for the last 30 days as of yesterday. And so there you can see that wet spot, one wet spot there in northwestern Iowa, but generally dry there from Montana, Wyoming, Colorado into the Dakotas, and Nebraska and Kansas, and also dry on the east side in Indiana. And the right percent of normal precipitation for the same 30-day period, this is just the last 30 days. There again, some areas wetter, particularly in Iowa, and kind of a swath through South Dakota and western North Dakota. But there again, dry, especially in southwestern Nebraska and Wyoming and Front Range of Colorado. The next slide here is 30-day temperature departure. This is from, again, just the last 30 days, so not the calendar month, but the last 30 days. And they're slightly, pretty much a mixed bag, but a little cooler than average there in eastern South Dakota, western Iowa. But some areas reaching, 3-4 degrees above average there in western Kansas and eastern Colorado. And then looking at the last 30 days as a whole, looking at precipitation on the next slide, this is look at last 90 days. And there again, pretty clearly wetter. Iowa, Missouri, of course, had several rounds of storms pass through there earlier this season, and generally just wetter in the eastern Corn Belt states there, and slightly drier there in Wyoming, Nebraska, Kansas, Colorado, that kind of three-state area. And we'll see some of the artifacts of that coming up in the drought monitor for the week, for the month. The next slide is something that we did see last month when Jim Angel gave this same webinar, looking at the climatological date of the first freeze, 32-degree freeze date. And so there again, that's just the climatology. So for much of the region, we're right around that time where we start thinking about that. The blue regions are more or less in September. The greener shaded areas generally have their first freeze in October. And to go to the next slide, shows the data that I pulled from the Midwest Regional Climate Center from their VIP website. The link is at the bottom there. And really there haven't been any freezes yet We've had some areas get down to mid-30s and 40s in late August, early September, but nothing really yet and nothing really coming, it seems, on the horizon, at least not a widespread frost or freeze in the next week or so. So we got a little bit of time yet in the growing season. And the next slide shows stream flow gauge data from the USGS. This is from this morning. And in general, pretty good shape in most of the watersheds that our region covers. Pretty good situation right now in the Missouri River Basin, Ohio River Basin, and the Front Range, despite the fact that we've been a little bit below normal for rainfall in the last month. That hasn't really impacted stream flow or reservoir storage to any great degree. So things are looking still pretty good for water resources at this time. The next slide shows the U.S. Drought Monitor map from this morning. So this is valid as of Tuesday morning. It was released today, this morning, and starting to see a little bit of abnormally dry conditions in the yellow shaded areas in some parts of the region, particularly Nebraska, Kansas, Colorado, that three-state area, a little area up in North Dakota that kind of touches northeastern South Dakota as well. Area hanging on with some short-term drought concern also in Iowa, Wisconsin. In general, nothing really of high impact at this time, but if you look at the next map on the next slide, you can see the change that we've seen over the last month, so more or less since the last webinar. And there has been some changes. The yellow areas had 1 class degradation, which is basically from no drought to abnormally dry conditions. And similarly, up in eastern Montana, and I guess in some areas in the Northern Rockies as well, also had 1 class degradation in the last month. Moving forward, there have been several impacts now that we're still seeing from the very wet spring, which if you've been listening to these webinars, it was pretty wet there in May, early June across the region, and even later than that in some areas, which delayed planting and increased some disease pressure with the increased moisture, soil moisture, and humidity across the region. So now we are realizing the impacts of that in lower yield, especially in the agricultural sector. And with the late planting, the plant development has been pushed along, 2 to 4 weeks in some areas, and so they were more susceptible to damage in that dry August that we've just had, especially in corn and soybeans. The dry areas, especially hastened maturity in corn, pushed it along a little faster, which can reduce yield. And also soybeans, often in our area, rely on moisture in August or during the grain fill stage. And again, with the dry August, it had a couple compounding impacts with the delayed planting concerns. Temperatures there again did reach 30s, 40s in a lot of areas, but no widespread frost. But there were some areas, such as sorghum in the agricultural area, that really does not like those cool temperatures, and so there may have been some small impact there as far as yield that we'll see later. The dry late summer that we've seen just recently could delay winter wheat planting later this fall. Several other agricultural impacts have been noted, and I believe Brad Rippey will be mentioning some of those later. And yet, on the next slide, we are still seeing some really good yields despite all of that. South Dakota and Minnesota both are looking at record or near record soybean yields in 2015 and this year. And the corn crop in both states is also rated pretty high for this time of year, with a lot of acres rated very good to excellent conditions. So if we continue with favorable climate for the next month or so, I believe we'll have some pretty good yields come out of those 2 states anyway. And as I mentioned, reservoir storage, stream flows, and in many basins in the region are looking pretty good at this time, and there are no real major concerns for water supply. All right, looking ahead now to the climate outlooks, I'll start short term here with the next 7 days, and then move forward to the 2-week and then the seasonal outlooks. So starting with the 7-day forecast in the next slide there, this is the total precipitation amounts for the next 7 days, and I pulled this map last night, so it may have changed a little bit till today, but in general looks favorably wetter on the eastern side of the region, and generally drier, lesser amounts on the western side of the region, and some little bullseyes there in northern Missouri and in Michigan. And the next slide, this is the 6 to 10 day forecast, the national forecast, and this is effective as of yesterday afternoon, so this afternoon has not yet been released. But looking at temperature on the left, more favorable towards above average temperatures across much of the lower 48 states in the 6 to 10 day period. That'd be the 22nd to 26th of September. And then on the right side, precipitation, leaning on the dry side, more favorably dry on the eastern side of the region, and a little bit increased probability of wetter there along the Rockies, Missouri, or I'm sorry, Wyoming and the eastern or western Dakotas. Okay. And the next slide looks at 8 to 14 days out, so that's September 24th to 30th. Again, that above average temperature area, that's more favored to be above average temperature, again, holding pretty strong there in the central states, centered right over the Dakotas and Nebraska, Minnesota area, with pretty high probabilities there in the dark reds and pinks. And then looks like wetter weather could be moving in with above average or higher probability, of being wetter in the Pacific Northwest and some of the western states. Okay. Looking at El Nino, I know Jim Angel last month gave a pretty good description of El Nino and what that means for our area, but here's a little update here. Based on just sea surface temperatures, the last 3-month period ranked as the 3rd warmest since 1950, so that's behind 87 and 97 El Nino years for that season. Some other measurements, just looking at August sea surface temperatures, show that the current sea surface temperature is now 2nd warmest behind 97, and that's just looking at the month of August. So the Climate Prediction Center and IRI are still looking at greater than 90% chance of El Nino continuing until March of next year, gradually weakening through the spring season. There are 2 recent briefs that have been released. One is El Nino impacts in the Missouri River Basin. The other is El Nino in the Midwest region, and they're both found on the drought.gov website. And they're just short 2-pagers. I'll show a picture of them in a minute. On the next slide is actual sea surface temperatures there in Celsius at the top, looking at the equatorial Pacific, and then the sea surface temperature anomaly at the bottom, which is what we're really looking at here with El Nino, with a bullseye there of 3 to 4 degrees or more above average. And so that's quite warm for this time of year. All right. So that's what's driving the situation here right now with El Nino. And here's a sample look at the latest Midwest region 2-page little brief that's describing El Nino impacts for that region. And it's a pretty good reference if you're looking for something on El Nino for the region.
And just to be clear, most of you or many of you who are on this call probably got access to this via email a week or 2 ago. If you'd like to get a copy of this and haven't seen it and can't find it, it's a little hard to find on drought.gov. So if you want a copy, feel free to write to me, doug.cluck@noaa.gov, and I will send you one.
Okay, great. Thanks, Doug. Okay, and the next slide, again, looks at probability of El Nino going into each season through the next year. So the bar on the far left, Dennis, if you could use the pointer there, ASO, August, September, October. And then you move to September, October, November, and on like that. Those red bars are indicating probability of El Nino in red. So very high likelihood, very high certainty that El Nino will hang with us here at least till the spring. All right, and then the next graph is just showing some of the forecast models that are used at IRI and the Climate Prediction Center that are forecasting El Nino going through again the next year. And again, pretty high confidence that El Nino is hanging in there. Anything over 0.5 on the anomaly side there is in El Nino territory on this graph. So it's a pretty strong event right now. Okay, the next slide is the outlook for October for temperature and precipitation. So here we are, just updated here this morning. The orange on the left is increased likelihood of warmer than average temperatures, which covers most of our region with the exception of some parts of Nebraska, Iowa, Kansas, Missouri, and Colorado. And on the right side is the precipitation outlook, again, just for the month of October, where most of our region is in equal chances of above, below, or near normal precipitation. The exception to that area would be the Great Lakes, which is favored on the dry side. The next slide shows October, November, December. So this is the 30-day or seasonal, or 90-day, sorry, or seasonal outlook through the end of the year. And again, the El Nino pattern generally shows warmer than average temperatures favored in the northern tier states, and the Climate Prediction Center hung on with that forecast with the strong El Nino we have in play right now. And then on the precipitation side, below average precipitation favored in the Pacific Northwest and then over the Great Lakes in the Northeast. And a lot of our region, though, is in that white area, again, equal chances of above, below, and near normal precipitation. Some of the southern tier states there are favored on the little bit on the wetter side, that'd be in the green. So slight leanings towards the wetter side for October through December. Looking ahead to the next season over the winter, this is a question that we get a lot, I know in South Dakota, many of you are wondering too. December, January, February over the winter season, very similar pattern as the last two maps, and warmer than average temperatures favored over the northern tier, and I believe they've increased the probabilities just a smidge on these as they did in the previous term through December. And then on the right side, favored drier again in the northern Rockies and over the Great Lakes. But a little further than Great Lakes, I guess. That'd be part of the Mississippi and Ohio River basins as well. So I'm in agriculture for the most part, and I know a lot of guys, especially livestock producers, are looking at potentially having open winter with the warmer than average temperatures and maybe below average precipitation. So I know that's something that some folks are thinking about and talking about. Looking at the next one then, the last of the outlooks that I'll show here today, March through May, this is the spring season. A little less confidence here, a little lower probabilities perhaps in that area is favored to be above average temperature in the northern tier, but they're still hanging on to that as a trend. And with El Nino impact again in the region, showing that pattern pretty confidently. And then in the right side there, precipitation, again, favored a little bit on the dry side over the Great Lakes and equal chances most everywhere else in the region with the exception of Colorado, and parts of Wyoming, Nebraska, Kansas. All right, kind of pulling all that together, looking at the precipitation and temperature outlook, and also where we stand currently on the drought monitor. This is the drought outlook for the next season, which is September through December. And not a whole lot of activity shown in our region, with the exception of the western part, where Montana and part of Wyoming are favored for some drought development there in the Northern Rockies. So certainly something to keep an eye on. I know water supplies and Missouri Basin is looking pretty good shape right now, but could be looking at potential for drier than average and some drought development there over the winter or late fall. All right, so last couple slides here. One, just a summary of the current conditions. That drier August, I suppose with the exception of South Dakota in that regard, had some negative impacts on row crops, and that continued dry conditions could impact winter wheat, and maybe also could be a benefit to some other areas though as well, like I know hunting and other activities in the fall season. Reservoirs generally in decent shape, really as carryover from some of the earlier rains that we had in the spring, early summer across much of the region. And then looking at the forecast in general, again, El Nino is still in play through the winter season. Pretty high confidence there. Fall season more likely warmer than average across the northern U.S., and that will looks to continue through the winter. And more likely drier than average across the Great Lakes region, again, through the winter season. And then just to reiterate, there's an enhanced probability of drier there in the northern Rockies and the eastern Corn Belt. So just to acknowledge some partners, a lot of folks have helped give me some information and some impacts to report from their area, and a lot of great resources, both regionally and nationally here on this website, or on this page, but many websites. And then the last one, I have my email there and phone number listed, but there are several other partners here who help put these webinars on. And like I said, the next webinar will be October 15th with Nolan Deskin. Doug, I'll turn it over to you if you want to take questions now, or if you'd rather Brad go next.
Yeah, I sort of said, hey, Brad's going to go next, but I never said what he did. So Dennis, there you go. While I'm sort of introducing Brad a little bit better, first of all, thank you, Laura, for the information. Lot to discuss in a short period of time. Brad is coming to us from the USDA. He actually works in something called the Joint Ag Weather Forecast Facility in Washington, D.C. Don't hold that against him. He actually does look at broadly across the U.S. at a lot of agricultural issues, and is I think officially, Brad, I think you're a meteorologist. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah, and we can hear you. That's even better. So
better. Tech work.
Brad is not only a meteorologist, but a climatologist as well, but works within agriculture. So like I said, this is sort of once a year we get him on to give us an update on the situation in terms of agriculture across the north central part of the U.S. And take it away, Brad.
All right, thanks, Laura, for setting up all the ag information here that I'm going to deliver, and thanks, Doug, for the introduction. As he mentioned, I am Brad Rippey, agricultural meteorologist with USDA for the almost 2 decades now, and I was with NOAA before that. And starting out here, I've got a picture that was taken by one of my USDA colleagues, an economist who has family in southeastern Minnesota, looking at some of that record corn crop on one of his family's farms there in southeastern Minnesota, looking just about 3 weeks ago. So things were looking really good as the corn started to dent. Looking at the next slide, I'm going to step through. First of all, looking at the real big two, corn and soybeans. And this is a representation of where corn is grown, with the yellow numbers indicating the 5-year averages on total corn production as it pertains to the U.S. So you can see we're looking right at the heart of the corn production, looking at these 14 states that we're focused on today. Next slide. gives a brief summary of the 2015 season. And I know, obviously, we had some big problems with the flooding and the wetness, followed by the August dry spell in a lot of the lower Midwest. But just on a very broad general scale, you have to say that it was mostly a good year for corn, and especially when you're looking at a lot of the northwestern and northern part of the Corn Belt, that was certainly true, as you'll see in a couple of slides. Now, September 1st estimates from USDA-NASS indicate that we should see record high corn production in 7 north central U.S. states, and it should end up being with the expected yield of 167.5 bushels per acre and 13.6 billion bushels, near record yield and production for the U.S. Drought, as Laura mentioned, really not an issue during the heart of the growing season, and currently more than 2/3 of the corn crop still rated good to excellent, as it has been most of the year. But we do have those degraded conditions across the southern Corn Belt states, stretching from Kansas to Ohio. Next slide. Just to delve in a little bit more and graphically into this, you can see that overlaying the Drought Monitor current map with the corn production areas, it's just really a non-factor. Now, even with that, though, we did see that drying trend in August in some of the southern Corn Belt areas. Ordinarily, probably would not have been a problem, but given the antecedent wetness, late planting, shallow rooting, and other factors, that did become a little bit of a factor in some of those southern states from Kansas to Ohio. On the next slide, we can see that, again, as I mentioned earlier, less than 5% of the corn production area was in drought during the entire heart of the Midwestern summer. Again, looking through June, July, August, we stayed at or below the 5% mark. In the next slide, going a little bit deeper into some of the corn numbers, these are the good to excellent ratings week by week plotted for the last 5 years. You can see how similar the conditions were for 2011 and 2013, which were certainly not optimal years. You can see the drought of 2012, that bottoming out. And then you can see that for 2014 and 15, we have a pretty similar pattern in that corn conditions stayed pretty steady through the growing season. The one difference is that things were a little bit more perfect last year. Conditions stayed in the 70s, good to excellent. This year, we started off about the same, but we did dip into the upper 60s to near 70 as the season progressed. On the next slide, these are the latest conditions as of September 13th, and I just circled the states that we're focusing on here. That's what the red circles are, the 14 states. And you can see the absolutely optimum conditions that we see in states like Minnesota at 88% good to excellent. The number below in brackets is the change from last year. Iowa also looking very good, as are other upper Midwestern states. But as I mentioned, we did have the problems with the wetness early in the season, late planting, and then later dryness as we moved into August from Kansas to Ohio, and that has kept conditions lower in those 5 states, and currently less than 60% in all 5 of those states, several below 50%. And hence conditions overall nationally are a bit lower than what we saw this time last year. The next slide provides, the next couple of slides will show some data from USDA-NASS lockup report from September 11th, and that just shows what I mentioned earlier, that we should see a number 3 corn production year in 2015, behind only the previous 2. And we're certainly within reach of 2013 if later estimates come up a little bit higher. So we're very close to what we saw 2 years ago, but a little bit below the record set last year. And the next slide provides a state-by-state assessment. I'm not going to dwell on this for very long in the interest of time, but I did want to mention, as I showed in the highlights, that for 7 north central states, including South Dakota, Nebraska, Minnesota, Iowa, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Kentucky, we do expect a record corn yield in 2015. Now, the blue and the reds you'll see on this chart and the soybean chart later, That's just the change from the August estimate. So estimates actually came down a little bit during August in several states, yet we're still expecting record numbers in, for example, Minnesota and South Dakota, despite a slight drop between the August 1st estimate and the September 1st estimate. Next slide. Looking at the current numbers for corn maturity, Laura talked a little bit about this, that we are seeing some delays in some areas, and in particular Michigan, Iowa, and Missouri are the furthest behind their respective 5-year averages for corn maturity in mid-September. Some of that dry weather in August seemed to help push the crop along in some other states, including Illinois, where we actually are ahead of the 5-year average for corn maturation at 61%. But that may have come at the expense of a little bit of yield potential, as it did turn unfavorably dry in previously wet areas. Nationally, 35% mature on September 13th, slightly behind the 5-year average of 40%. On the next slide, the corn harvest just getting underway as we move into mid-September. Furthest along, you see Kentucky at 20%, Missouri at 14%, but both of those are significantly behind the 5-year average pace. And we do expect, for the most part, the harvest to be somewhat but not significantly delayed due to some of those developmental delays that we've seen in most of the Corn Belt. Moving to the next slide. We're going to switch gears from talking about corn and run through a similar set of slides about soybeans. You can see the footprint of soybean production is very similar to that of corn, focusing on the breadbasket or the Midwest. There is an extension down further to the south that we don't see with corn through the Mississippi Valley. The next slide provides some of the highlights here, just going quickly through those. Now, for most of the northern and western Corn Belt, it was a good year for soybeans. The same cannot be said. Soybeans encountered even more difficulties than corn across the lower Midwest. Probably hardest hit was Missouri, which did experience a significant reduction in acreage, land that just could not be planted due to the wetness. Nevertheless, if you put the whole picture together, you still see record high soybean production in 6 north-central states, and that being Iowa, Kentucky, Michigan, Minnesota, Nebraska, and South Dakota. And it looks like our soybean yield and production will both be the second highest on record, behind only 2014. Like corn, we saw very little drought during the growing season, and currently ratings are slightly lower than that for corn, partly due to the problems in the lower Midwest, 61% good to excellent, but we see numbers as low as 35% good to excellent in some of the hard-hit flood states from earlier, including Missouri. Next slide. This will be the drought chart. No need to dwell on this. Drought, effectively a non-factor for most of the Midwest, although, as Laura mentioned, we did see some of the August dryness hurting the very late planted crop across the mid-Mississippi Valley and adjoining areas in the lower Midwest. On the next slide, again, you can see the graphical temporal representation of drought. We did have a little dryness early in the season in the upper Midwest. That was vanquished by rain that fell during May and June. So we went through the heart of the growing season with no soybean drought. Next slide. Soybean conditions started off running pretty close to what we saw in 2011 and 2013, but unlike those 2 years, conditions have held roughly steady, and so we've ended up the season about where we started back in June, in the low 60s, good to excellent. That's below the record that was set last year when we had the record production and yield numbers, but far better, of course, than the drought year of 2012 on the bottom. On the next slide, looking through more of the soybean charts, we can see what I mentioned earlier in the verbiage, that we have had some big issues from Kansas to Ohio with the same weather challenges that we mentioned for corn, and Missouri being the hardest hit, just 35% good to excellent currently. That's a huge change from last year when the corn at this time was more than 70% good to excellent. But we have some really good lush-looking soybean fields that are just starting to mature across the northern Corn Belt, and we see numbers there as high as 75 to 80% good to excellent in states like Iowa, South Dakota, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. In the next slide, there's the soybean production forecast, 3.94 billion bushels in 2015. Compare that to the record of 3.97 set last year. Acreage was a bit higher this year, hence we're very close to what we saw for production last year. In the next slide, this from the lockup report of September 11th, you can see the individual state numbers, and like corn, we do have a number of records expected to be set this year. States like South Dakota, Nebraska, Minnesota, Iowa, and Michigan, along with Kentucky, all currently pegged to set records for state yield, and the U.S. number at 47.1 bushels per acre would be second only to 2014. In the next slide, soybeans are maturing rather quickly across the upper Midwest, making the threat of a frost even less significant this year. And as Laura mentioned, there is no frost in sight over the next several days. So really getting through the season without too much of a scare with low temperatures. We're seeing North Dakota actually leading the Midwest in soybeans dropping leaves, 68%, well ahead of schedule. So the upper Midwest crop development is very good for soybeans, but we do see some delays as you move further to the south and east, and where cool weather earlier and wet weather early in the season really slowed things down. In the next slide, I did want to mention a few other agricultural highlights besides just corn and soybeans. For the region, spring wheat harvest is wrapping up early, largely because planting was very quick this year. We are seeing hard red winter wheat planting underway on the plains, and we need rain in some areas. As Laura mentioned, we got some dry pockets. Sugar beet harvest is off to a quick start this year, like spring wheat, because of early planting. It was dry early in the year in the upper Midwest, so we had some quick planting progress there. We do have good news for the sugar beet producers and sorghum producers in the region. National numbers up 10% from last year's production on sugar beets and up a third on sorghum. I did want to mention, although it's kind of old news now, we did have some weather challenges going back to last winter and spring that did affect 2015 fruit and vegetable crops. And finally, rangeland and pastures are mostly in great shape in the north central U.S., especially considering that it's September when things are often at their brownest in terms of grasses. Moving through some of the graphical highlights of that text, next slide, we'll start with the spring wheat area. You can see that historically a very large percentage of the spring wheat comes down to the Dakotas and Minnesota. And moving to the next slide, looking at the harvest progress for that crop, as of mid-September, it's hard to find a winter wheat field or a spring wheat field left to harvest, as harvest wrapping up about 2 weeks early in the north central U.S. Next slide. Looking at the winter wheat crop, this is the crop that we're going to first look at the previous year's crop, the one that was planted in 2014, harvested in the spring and summer of 2015. So if you go to the next slide, you can see that we had some big challenges with the 2015 wheat crop. This is, again, the crop that was planted a year ago in the fall of 2014. It turned cold early. The crop never had a chance to become established in places like South Dakota and Nebraska. It really suffered at the hands of the very harsh winter, especially when snow cover was not present to insulate the crop. So we had a very rough-looking winter wheat crop in 2015 spring in places like South Dakota and Nebraska. Then the wetness hit the soft red winter wheat crop from Missouri to Michigan, and that also affected the crop. So we had a subpar winter wheat crop in a lot of the central United States in 2015. Next slide. shows that harvest was delayed, especially in the lower Midwest, the soft red winter wheat, by that June wetness. A very delayed and very difficult harvest season, a lot of disease pressure on the winter wheat that was harvested in the late spring and summer of 2015. The next slide brings the information forward a month to the end of July, still struggling to harvest a few of the winter wheat fields as we move to the end of July across the lower Midwest. Notice that Michigan at that point, less than half harvested. Now as you move forward 7 weeks to the current winter wheat crop, the one that is just being planted at this time, you notice that progress has been pretty good. It's been fairly dry lately in Colorado, South Dakota, so we've seen some real good winter wheat planting progress. But in some areas, including reports in Nebraska coming in that there's just not enough moisture for winter wheat germination, producers are opting to hold off on planting winter wheat until some rain falls. So we have to keep an eye on that to see if this dryness continues to evolve. That could affect the 2016 winter wheat crop in terms of establishing the crop this fall. And we are just starting to see the first few fields planted of the soft red winter wheat across the lower Midwest as of mid-September. Next slide. Winter wheat experiencing drought at this time. Well, we don't officially have drought in much of the central and north central U.S., but we do have a lot of dryness starting to show up, which is yellow or D0 on the drought monitor map in places like southern and western Nebraska, which is key wheat country. So that will be something that drought monitor folks will be watching in the next few weeks to see if there's any necessary expansion or development of drought in some of those areas. Next slide. I'm not sure what happened here, so, okay, there we go. Just wanted to mention, as I said before, sugar beet planting was early, so harvesting is taking place early, off to a good start in the states from North Dakota through Michigan. And the next slide. Sorghum is another crop that we saw a big jump from last year in terms of the production, and the crop is now maturing across the central U.S. The next slide will show the harvest progress, and that is just getting underway in some of the central states, including Missouri at 6%, and just starting the harvest in Illinois and South Dakota. Next slide summarizes from the crop production report that came out 6 days ago. Sorghum up 33% from last year's production forecast. Sugar beets up 10%. Next slide, we will move into a very brief summary of a couple of specialty crops. I will mention that specialty crop information is very tough to get, at least quantitative information, because a lot of this data for many crops isn't released until the following year. But we do have cherry information. Just wanted to mention that tart cherries, which Michigan truly dominates, many years produces at least 3/4 of the U.S. crop. There was a freeze in May that significantly reduced the crop. If you look at the lower lines, you can see Michigan production as recently as 2013 was well over 200 million pounds of tart cherries. That number plunged to 134 back in 2015, largely due to the May freeze. And we did see harsh enough winter in Wisconsin that we actually had cherry tree mortality, and it has been a tough couple of winters for fruit tree producers in much of the Midwest due to the harsh winters that we've seen. We've heard of reports of other trees, peaches, apples, being harmed by the harsh winter. Next slide has a brief mention of pumpkin. This is not pumpkin like what you put on your doorstep for the trick-or-treaters. This is the pumpkin that you buy in the cans. And there was an impact from the wet weather that we saw in Illinois earlier in the year. Expectations from some of the company folks say that yield of pumpkins for canning could be off by as much as a third. And interestingly, 90% of the pumpkins grown in the U.S. are raised within a 90-mile radius of Peoria, Illinois. So that's something that I learned doing a little bit of research here this week. Next slide. Just want to briefly mention from a livestock and pasture and range perspective that for most of the growing season and the summer, we've had very lush pasture conditions in the north central U.S. And even now, as we move deep into September, we still have 75% good to excellent pasture ratings in Minnesota. In fact, every one of our 14 states that we're looking at here, above 50% good to excellent, except Indiana, which suffered not only from the wetness, but also from the dryness as we moved into August. So kind of an adverse year, not just for crops, but pastures in Indiana. And the next slide, as we move to the end here, this is U.S. pasture conditions, crazy spaghetti map, but the take-home point here is that the last 2 years, 2014 and 15, near record pasture conditions, U.S. level, on the 21-year period of record. Only 1997 joins in with the last 2 years as being very lush, and that all despite the western drought, which just shows that the plains and Midwestern greenery that we saw in 2014 and 15, fairly unusual from the perspective of the last couple of decades. And with that, I believe that pretty much wraps the agricultural story up, and we can open it up to questions.
All right, thank you very much, Brad. Appreciate that, and thank you for all of you who have stayed on the line this long. If you want to, hopefully, if you want to make a question or have a comment, push star 6 and go for it, so to speak. Any questions for anybody? I'll bring out one point. Laura mentioned the dryness, potential dryness from El Nino this fall and winter, potentially into next spring in the northwest part of Montana, basically western and central Montana. That is a fairly common feature for El Nino, is to affect the snowpack and to reduce it to some degree. No one's going to tell you exactly what that's going to be. I don't think anybody can predict that, but there generally is, there are repercussions from El Nino, negative repercussions for the snowpack in that area. So we are watching that fairly closely, and you may see that highlighted on a number of different briefings that we put out over the next few months as it unfolds.
Doug, this is Jeff Morse. I'm wondering if could the slide be made available?
That slide right there?
No, the ones that we just saw, the ag slides.
We'll like with all of our presentations, hopefully I'm recording this number 1, and we'll put that on a website as well as the PDF files of both of these. If any of you individually need or think you want the PowerPoints themselves, I think I don't know. I asked Laura and Brad if we can send those out.
That's fine with me, Doug.
Okay. And Laura?
Yep, that's okay with me.
Okay. So I guess just write to me if you want the PowerPoints. Otherwise, wait 24 hours or until next Monday or something like that, and we can send. We'll have the PDFs and we'll have all the other stuff on those websites that we advertise every time I send you an email, sort of reminding you of these monthly webinars. There's a link on there to go to get the information from the last one. Use those links, and you can go get all the information that we're presenting here. I think at the very beginning, Dennis, there's.
Oh, it's the slide 2 at the top, I believe.
Yeah, second slide. There's a couple of places to go to get them. But Jeff, if you want the PowerPoints, no problem. I'll get them to you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Doug, can you send it to Patrick too, please?
You bet, Patrick. Send me an email, Patrick, so I do not forget, please.
I'll do it right now.
Yep. Any other questions or comments? I hope this was useful to you. It was a little extra long. I understand that, but we have an incredible amount of information stuffed into about 50 minutes there. So Again, I hope it was useful to you all. I'll give one last shout out. Any other questions or comments?
Great presentation today, everybody.
Thanks, Patrick.
Thank you.
Hey, Doug, this is Dennis. I guess I would ask people too: is this covering things sufficiently right now, or do we need to focus on subsets, especially as we get into El Nino? Do we need to be concerned and looking at state of Missouri River Basin as we get into El Nino, the heart of the El Nino year here?
Right. And if you don't want to answer that over the phone, feel free to write to us and let us know if there are other things or other dimensions that we're not covering, etc. Or if you want to be a guest speaker. Anyway.
Hey, Doug.
Yes.
Hey, this is Brian. Question for the Ag World next summer. What's your projections, for the Corn Belt next summer? And what are the things that we need to watch? What are the keys to watch?
Brad, do you want to try that?
Yeah, I can tackle it. There's a huge amount of uncertainty on what happens if and when El Nino fades away. We do have a very limited set of strong El Ninos to look at. For example, here's the conundrum that we have looking ahead to next summer's growing season. 1997-98, we had a significant drought that was mostly confined to the southern one-third of the United States, really hit areas from Texas to the southeast, but left the Midwest largely unaffected. 1982-83, we had a very wet spring, and then we had devastating heat. We had a wet spring almost nationwide, and then a devastating hot spell that hit the Midwest in July and August. So you have to not only understand what's going on with El Nino and its transition to whatever's next, but other prevailing patterns in the Pacific and Atlantic can influence what's going to happen. So you really can't jump out there and say, oh, here comes a big Midwestern drought, or it's going to be a good season, because there's just not enough outcomes to really try to get a good handle on it.
No, understood. That sounds good, Brad. Do you have a current, I realize it's a long shot, but do you have a current projection, and what are the other things that we need to watch, in your opinion?
No, I would refer you to like the outlooks by the National Weather Service Climate Prediction Center, which go out over a year, but they're not going to show much confidence once you get beyond the spring.
Okay.
And at this point, there's so much going on that we don't really understand, like the warm water, along with the El Nino that's over the North Pacific, that could play into what happens next year. So a lot of uncertainty once you get beyond spring.
Nope, understood. Okay, thank you.
Sure.
This is Dennis Toddy. To piggyback on that, there has been a significant amount of discussion about what happens with strong El Ninos. That El Ninos this strong in the past have shown a tendency to dissipate very quickly. So what we should watch is when El Nino starts to dissipate and how quickly it dissipates, and then that will start being reflected in the outlooks and what might be coming for next summer with how quickly we would transition out of this El Nino.
So the timing of the turn is important, and if it happens March, April, is the summer look more questionable then, or what's the timing of the turn that would be the worst or the most adverse?
Probably the earlier that it starts to dissipate, the higher the likelihood.
And
Perfect.
Understand that this El Nino is, the prognosis is that it will peak in like, I hope I'm getting this right, November, December, and it's on a downslide after that. How quickly it goes on that downslide is a big question that no one's going to be able to answer exactly, but they do tend, as Dennis and Brad were saying, they do tend to snowball, I guess, down the hill pretty quickly once they get going.
Yep.
But again, it's an odd year for a lot of reasons in the oceans because of the broad warmth. There's even some speculation that this El Nino won't behave like other El Ninos because of that broad warmth across the eastern North Pacific. Some people don't think it's going to be a factor at all, and some people think it may be. So,
okay.
Hey, Doug and Dennis, this is Diane.
Yes.
I got a quick question. So 86 and 76, was that not an El Nino years? Were those not El Nino years?
You're stretching.
There was
Yeah, go ahead.
El Nino started in the fall of 76 and in the fall of 86. So the timing was different than, this was an early onset El Nino. It started much earlier in the year.
Why do you ask, Diane? Did you have some repercussions or some impacts on those years?
Well, I mean, we had major snowstorms and blizzards and so forth in a lot of the areas, and flooding started in the Dakotas. Wasn't that about 96, that one? And I know, you know, I was in New York then, so I know the 86 and 96 were significant snowfall years for New York.
Yeah.
The common El Niños that this is being compared to from a winter standpoint are 82, 83, and 97, 98, because they are expected to be similar in strength to those years. So those are the ones that are being looked at as what we call composites or comparison years, to see what happened during those years and you know, what is likely to happen this year compared to those.
But as you know, as a good scientist, we all hate to have just two comparisons. We would rather have 30 to 1,000 different events to be able to actually do some real significant statistics on. We don't. So we're you know, that's what we're sort of stuck with, is looking back at past realizations of what El Nino does. And believe me, it's pretty wide and varying, especially, I hate to say this, but especially across the Midwest.
And Diane, the other thing we try to caution people about is when we talk about general patterns of El Nino, we cannot say anything about individual storms. In the middle of a typical El Nino winter, you can have one or two individual storms that can cause some problems. We can't say anything about an individual event. We're assessing the whole season as a whole.
Can I have a question for Brad? Nolan Duskin here.
Go, Nolan. I hear you.
Okay. What's the deal with sorghum? We were seeing more sorghum planted in Colorado than we've ever seen before.
I don't know if it was a financial decision or if it was an expectation. Sorghum tends to be a bit more drought tolerant, so maybe if there were some expectations of dryness and limited subsoil moisture that we've seen for many years across the high plains, perhaps.
So it's probably an acres planted increase, not just a yield increase.
That's absolutely true, yes.
Thanks.
Any other comments, questions? Okay, I think we've probably gone long enough. We're a little over an hour, so I want to thank both of our speakers very much for their time and effort here. I want to thank everybody else who joined in, and we'll wrap it up, and we will redo this on October 15th, 1 p.m. Central Daylight Time, where the guy who just spoke, Nolan Duskin, will be our presenter. Thank you very much, everyone, and until next time, see you later.